Hi, my name is Nikki Schoonover, and I am the training coordinator of Every Child's Hope. Today we're going to be talking about client rights and confidentiality, which is one of our required trainings at ECH. And the reason it's required is first and foremost that client rights and confidentiality is really important, and we'll dig more into that. It's also required just as a basic requirement through our accrediting agency. So this is a really important training. I know it's not the most exciting topic, but hopefully it won't be too bad. It's going to take us about an hour. We're going to go through all of the things you need to know about client rights and confidentiality. I'll let you know where you can go if you have further questions after this is over, and then we will take a short little quiz together. So that's what the next hour is going to look like. So let's get right into it. So let's just think about for a minute when we are the client or the patient at a doctor's office or a counselor's office or a psychiatrist's office. What do we expect from the people that treat us? What do we want out of our confidential information when we go there? So I'll just let you take a minute and think about that. So hopefully some things came to mind about what you expect out of the people who treat you. And so we want to think the same way about the kids that we work with at Every Child's Hope. And so that means that we may treat them with privacy, respect, or quality care. Those are probably some of the things that you thought about that you would like to be treated with. And their information is really important and it's very private. And so we want to make sure that we do a good job of keeping that information confidential and make sure that we respect their rights. Also, when we're thinking from a trauma-informed lens, trust and relationship are really big in those things. And when we have confidentiality and when we respect people's rights, we build that trust and we build that relationship with them. And so making sure we respect clients' confidentiality and clients' right are central to the work that we do here at Every Child's Hope. And we want to make sure we're maintaining that. That's why this training is so important. So let's start with client rights. So all ECH clients have what we call universal rights, which means that there are certain rights that all clients have by being a client here at ECH. So for example, all clients at ECH have the right to have their confidentiality respected, to have their information handled in a confidential way. And so on top of that, we also have client rights for different programs. So for example, there at the Stepping Stone program in Kansas City, you have specific rights to your kids there that kids who are in, for say, our residential treatment program here in St. Louis or are in our school here at St. Louis may not have. So it's important for you to understand that there are rights that are specific to your program. And you can see the policies are also in each of these PowerPoints. I don't know if you have a copy of those. They're all in Inspire, and we usually hand them out during our trainings. So they're listed here if you want to see the exact policy that talks about the client rights. So we inform clients of their rights. We post them at every service location. There's a written acknowledgement at admission. We make sure to go over the rights that they have and know the rights that they have because their information is really important and their treatments is really important, and we want them to know that they have rights as a client of ECH and should be treated as such. So if clients feel their rights have been violated, they can file a grievance. And this can happen because of privacy or confidentiality breaches. So clients feel like their privacy or confidentiality hasn't been kept. They can file grievances about discrimination, or if they feel like the service quality isn't up to par with what they feel like they should be provided with. They can grieve to external parties or internal parties. So we're going to talk about that a little more. So what that means is they can grieve, they can have a grievance against an external party. So if they're contracted, for instance, with Children's Division or Department of Mental Health, they can file a grievance with them about Every Child's Hope and say that we're not doing something that we should be doing or providing something we should be doing. They can also do that with a managed care company, the state or the federal government, our accreditation body, which is the Council on Accreditation. So those are all external places that clients can go to and say ECH isn't handling, for example, my private information correctly. Clients can also file grievance within ECH. And how that works is that we suggest that clients address the matter with their primary staff. So this probably happens all the time where something happens and a client or a family member of a client feels like they weren't treated fairly or treated right. And so they can come to their primary staff and talk about that. And a lot of times we can sit down with the client and come up with a solution or correct a misunderstanding or what's ever gone on. And that's kind of the end of what happens, and we fix the situation right at that level. However, if for some reason the client is still upset or still frustrated, or the family of the child is still upset or still frustrated, they can take that up to the next level. They may also do this if the grievance is about their primary staff and they don't really feel comfortable going to that person. They can go to that primary staff supervisor. It can continue up the chain of command to that person's supervisor. There's 3 levels of appeal, which contain a hearing and decision by a site director and the chief operating officer. So clients can go all the way up to the top of the agency with a grievance if they feel that they need to do that, if it's not being handled at some of those lower levels. So there aren't a whole lot of external grievances filed by clients or internal grievances at all. We only have about 1 or 2 a year that reach the highest level of internal appeal, which is that site supervisor and chief operating officer that we talked about. And this suggests that, ECH staff are very respectful of client rights and daily practices, like we talked about, that most things are able to be solved at the primary staff level or the primary staff supervisor, that our staff are effective in mediating problems before they escalate. Staff notice that something's not right or something's not okay, and so they take that into account. They try to do something to remedy that before it gets to the point where a client feels like they need to file a grievance. And clients are taken seriously, as they should be. We are here for our clients. That's why we exist, is to take care of the kids at ECH, and we should hear them out when they feel like they're not being treated fairly and help them come to an understanding. So it doesn't necessarily need to go up the chain of command. So we are going to move on to talk about confidentiality. So there are some rules and laws that govern confidentiality. You've probably heard of HIPAA, which is that first one, HIPPA, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. That's a federal law, so it's the big overarching law that governs all kinds of health information, which includes your private health information when you see a doctor, any medical or mental health professional, as well as the kids that are here, because they're here for mental health treatment. We also have some state laws that govern confidentiality, as well as Department of Social Services, Department of Health and Human Services, and Department of Mental Health, DMH, and their operating services. So all of these rules around confidentiality cause a lot of regulations to be put in place, and there are a lot of things we can and can't do, and there are a lot of things we can and can't share. And so let's kind of boil that down a little bit. So client confidentiality is an obligation that ECH staff, you, me, anyone who works at ECH, have a right to preserve the privacy information about a client. And we're going to talk specifically about what is confidential information, but to make it really simple, the fact that a client even lives at Stepping Stone, involved with Stepping Stone program, or any ECH program for that matter, is confidential. So that's the big overarching piece, and then all of their other information falls under that too. So, a good example is if you have a kid move onto the Stepping Stone campus, and let's say your kid goes to school with them, you can't go home at night and say, oh, Jamie started coming to ECH, telling her story, just the fact that they're even here. Our receptionists and people who work the phones have certain ways that they even get around that when people ask if someone's a client, because we're not even allowed to tell someone that without the proper information. So confidential information is any information that discloses the identity of a client and relates to a client's past or current use of ECH services. Talk a little more about this. So client information is acquired, which means we obtain it. Excuse me. And disclose only on a need-to-know basis. And only the minimum necessary client information is to do our job or satisfy a request as acquired or disclosed. This is exactly from HIPAA. It comes straight from the law. The words need to know and minimum necessary are in there. So that basically means that we can only give out information to people who are approved to have that information, and even then we only give them a small amount of that information and try to give them as little as possible. So a good example for this that we usually use in this training, it's a classic examples that's been using, is a food pantry. What is it that if a family goes to a food pantry to request food, what might that food pantry need to know about that family? I'll give you a little time to think about it. They may need to know how many people are in the family, maybe their zip code, maybe their income. They really don't need to know things like the mental health diagnosis of the family. Don't really need to probably know like the family's social security information or citizen status or any of those kind of things. So it's the same things when we're thinking about the kids that we work with. Some people need to know, right? So people who are involved in the treatment of the client, there's certain information that therapists may find out or house staff may find out that they need to share with each other, right? So we have to be judicious about that information because not necessarily everything shared in the therapy session needs to be shared, but there are certain things that we do need to share. We also have to let payers, insurance, and reimbursement sources know. And we do, try and give them as least amount of information as possible, but they do have to have some information about the client in order to pay us. And then person involved in agency operations, so supervisory staff, QA staff, students. And when we have practicum students here, they're going to have some confidential information about kids. QA staff has to run, lots of data and information about treatment of clients, so they're going to have to know some of that, like demographic kind of things, age, race, sexual orientation, and sometimes they may know more information too because they're kind of looking at like incident reports and those kind of things. So they're going to need to know some of that information. And then persons conducting lawful duty. So anytime someone like a first responder is involved, someone like a police officer, EMT, medical personnel, they're going to need to know who that person is, how old are they, what kind of medications are they taking, possibly any diagnoses, because that's going to come into play in how they treat them and how they help them, especially in a medical emergency situation. And then when we look at abuse and neglect, we're obviously going to have to share some confidential information. You've probably done another training on abuse and neglect, but if you make a hotline report, they're going to need to know names, ages of the other children, of the child you're calling about, the address, what happened. They're going to need to know lots of information. And then public health officials, so people that are taking care of our kids health-wise, or that's a nurse or a doctor, they're going to need to know some information. Courts often need to know information about situations, kids' backgrounds sometimes. And then sometimes our regulatory sources, that's probably more like demographic information, race, sex, age, how long they've been in care, maybe diagnosis, treatment that they've had, but they might need to know some of those things. And then there are consensual parties. So there may be other people whom the client has provided consent. So they want us to tell another adult or another treatment provider, or if they go on to another program or to a foster home, they're going to provide consent for us to be able to tell them about their treatment and their treatment needs here at ECH. So the minimum necessary is the least amount of client information necessary to satisfy a particular purpose or carry out a function. So this means that we want to make sure that even in those situations where we do have to share confidential information, how much do we really need to share? When we talked about the food pantry example, it's a really good example. And it's the same thing that, like, when we work with an insurance provider or we work with a regulatory information, do they really need to have their therapy notes? Probably not. It's probably more about diagnosis, or how long was the therapy session, or how long have they been at ECH, or what sexual orientation do they identify as, or what race do they identify as, so we can have some of that demographic data. But they don't necessarily need to read all of their incident reports or anything like that. So we think about, within context, what is minimal of necessary. We try to give more, not less. And then you have to think about what information is being disclosed, to whom, for what purpose. And so that's really thinking through, like, how come they need this information? What do they really need to make the decision? Kind of goes back to that food pantry example that we talked about. So this is just a graphic to kind of talk about that we're thinking about the need to know, the minimum necessary, and we're only releasing that to people who need to know it or have been given consent for that information. So confidentiality applies to everything that we do here at ECH, and all the information that we have about kids. So, any kind of communication, like oral communication, written communication, electronic communication. So that means anytime we talk about clients, we shouldn't be talking about them in public areas while we're out at lunch for Panera, or we shouldn't be talking about them while we're getting a slushie at the gas station, or we shouldn't be yelling about them across campus. We also should be careful that when we, write something like a progress note or a incident report, we should be thinking about what that information that we're sharing, and knowing that that's confidential, but also that is information that could be shared with a third party. And then electronic, anytime we are communicating over email, that is a chance that something could happen to that email. So whether that's internal to other people through ECH, or whether that's external through other people outside of ECH, we need to be careful about the information we're sharing, the names that we're using. Text messaging and social media also falls into that electronic place, where we should not be friends with kids on social media. Never, ever, even after they've left ECH. And we should never be sharing information that's confidential over text messages. So if you do have to text about a kid, use their initials, not using their full name, not using the full situation. Hopefully that's not something that's happening. Best practice would be that you don't text about clients, because someone can see that information. It can pop up on your phone. And if you do have a phone and you are texting about certain situations, make sure it's password protected. That's why our computers are password protected. Should also say, falls into the same category. If you see a kid who is a current client, or maybe even has been a client at ECH at the gas station or at Walmart or at the library, you would never go up to them and say hi and how are things going since you left ECH, and I'm so proud of you for blah blah blah, and how so and so. Like, if they come up to you, that's another situation. Say hi, but still don't volunteer any of their information. Let them lead the conversation. It applies to that. It applies to the disclosure and the acquisition. So that means giving out information and taking in information. So, of course, anything we give out to anyone, we need to make sure falls into our confidentiality standards, thinking about the minimum necessary, thinking about who needs to know, thinking about if we have consent to tell them that information, and then also if we acquire any information. So if we get information from a third party or have information from a third party, we apply our same confidentiality standards to that. And we talked a little bit about this, but it does apply to how we communicate information both externally and internally. So we're thinking about how we talk about a kid in our offices versus also how we talk about with a kid to an agency or someone outside of ECH. So how do we inform clients about their confidentiality rights? So we give them universal rights. They're provided when they come into our programs. They look over them with their guardian, with their family, and they make sure that they agree to those rights, make sure they don't have any questions. And then they're also posted at each service location. So we have them posted visibly so that family and kids can see those. And like I said, we have them sign them, and they're acknowledged when they come into admission. So clients have special rights about their records and the information that we have about them. It's their records, it's their information. They have a right to inspect and copy their record. They have information to amend information to be complete or incomplete or inaccurate in their record. They can ask for an accounting of all of the disclosures of their information we've given out. So they can ask for an accounting of who have you given my information to? Can I have a list of that? They can make restrictions about who disclosures are made to. So they don't have to provide consent for certain people if they don't want to. That's up to them and to their guardians. And then they have a right to confidential communications, which means that we need to be confidential about how we're communicating about them, and then they get to communicate confidentially as well. So, those are how those go. And if you have a client who wants to inspect and copy their record, there's a process for that. So, if a client asks to do that, make sure you talk to your supervisor and kind of talk about how you do that. So there are limits to confidentiality. We talked a little bit about this when we were talking about the minimum necessary. So sometimes we do have to disclose things to treatment, payment, and administrative activities in response to a written authorization, which means someone has requested that we give them information and the client has approved for us to give information to that person. They've written that, they've signed that consent. In response to legal action. With subpoenas and court orders, there's often very little wiggle room. So when we get something from the court, a lot of times we are going to have to share some confidential information, and we're going to have to break that confidentiality. Hopefully in all these situations we can allow the client to know that or talk to the client about that so they're aware, because sometimes that feels less out of control. Also, of course, emergency. We have to let medical and psychiatric emergency people know. If we take a kid to the hospital for suicidal ideation, they're going to have to know some information. Mandated reporting of abuse or neglect allegations, missing person reports, illegal conduct by a client involving the organization, and duty to warn when a client presents danger of violence to an identifiable victim. So that last one is that duty to warn is a law. It's a federal law, and it came out of, someone saying to their therapist or mental health professional, I'm going to kill so and so, and went out and did that, and that person was not warned. So out of that has come this law where if someone reports to us they're going to hurt or kill someone and they have a plan and we really think that they're going to carry through with that, we have to warn that victim, and as well as the police. So that's an important one to be listening to and be aware of. Let's talk about safeguards that we put in place here at ECH to promote confidentiality. There are things that we do as checks and balances to make sure that we keep information of our clients confidential. So the first one we're going to talk about, we've already talked about a little bit, is an external release of information. And we do not share information with outside programs or parties. For instance, maybe a doctor or a psychiatrist or a program that a client may be going to or coming from, without this release. And this release is signed by the client or the client's guardian at times. And we want to make sure we have that signed before we share information with them. It's really important. There's also probably a release that client or client's guardian will sign from that agency. So really both of those need to be signed before we can share information. But for sure we want to make sure that the client is giving us permission to be able to share any type of information with someone who is outside of every child's hope. We also do things internally with the information we have of clients to make sure that we're keeping their information confidential. So one of those things is with hard copy records, we want to make sure that things are locked, and they are locked behind 2 locks. So sometimes that looks like a locked file cabinet and a locked door in someone's office, but we always want to make sure that they're locked. We also make sure that they're signed out, so we know exactly where that file is, and then they're returned when not needed. We shouldn't be taking hard copy records off premises. We shouldn't be taking them home. There is a risk there that they could get lost or stolen, or a number of things could happen to them. So we want to make sure that we're returning them at the end of our workday to a safe place, locked behind 2 doors, that people who shouldn't have access to them can't get access to them. So that's something that we do. We also do things to electronic records. So electronic records have kind of their own level of concerns, and we'll talk about that in a minute, because it's easy for them to be shared across programs, across emails or phones. It happens pretty quickly, more quickly than we could share hard copy records sometimes. So we have passwords on our computers, we have firewalls, we have VPNs and encryption, which just means that things are secured electronically, and someone can't get it if it goes through an email or over Wi-Fi. We also have things that are secured by program or role. So for instance, if you are working in the Stepping Stone program in Kansas City, you probably don't need to know about a kid who's here on the St. Louis campus at the ECH school, and vice versa. So the records that you can access are going to be specific to your program, because you don't really need to know what's going on in another program. Now, sometimes you do, and so there are things that we do to make sure that that information is provided on a need-to-know basis, but it's not a routine thing that we would provide someone at Kansas City Stepping Stone about a client who is at the ECH school. So that's how that works. Now, it's really important that we follow these protocols, because if there is a breach in confidentiality, we have to disclose that to the client. We have to put a public notice out that that's happened, and then we have to figure out a remedy for the client. And this is something that has happened before. We had a individual that was working at a different organization, but shared office space here in St. Louis. And he was fired, let go, quit. And we, in this organization, found ECH documents in his desk drawer. So he was able to get access to those documents that he shouldn't have even had. They obviously were not put back where they were supposed to be put back. And I'm not really sure why he even needed those documents or how he got them. But that's unfortunate because that means that that client's information was shared with someone that they shouldn't have been. So that, was a confidentiality breach. And as well, it creates a lot of work for us to make sure that we follow the law and remedy that situation. And it's just not a good situation for anybody. So let's talk a little bit more about confidentiality in regards to electronic data storage. So tons of client data is stored electronically. That's just the age that we're in. That's how things work. So there are special things that we need to think about when we're considering this. We want to make sure that we are not sending email outside the ECH network. So what I mean by that is when you're sending email that is from your house or from a Starbucks or from a Panera, that Wi-Fi is not as secure as when you send it on your campus. You also have to be careful when you send email to other providers. So if you do have that release and you are making that contact, you want to be careful what you put in that email. So, for example, using client's name or identifying information, birthday, social security number, all of those things. You want to try and leave as much of that out as you can. Example of this is that we had a therapist who was in our Family Solutions for Kids program. So that's our program that goes into homes and does counseling. And she had a release to talk to another person involved with her client's case. And our therapist, would send an email and refer to the client using his initials. Well, when she would get an email back from the other person, from the other agency, that person referred to the client with their full name. And so she would continue to reply just using the initials of the client. And so we want to make sure that we're doing that as much as possible, that we want to be holding ourselves to a high standard of confidentiality. So some other things that can happen is that sometimes information can be stored on jump drives or external hard drives or laptops. And those things are easy to have leave the office. And sometimes they're necessary to take outside the office. But we have to be careful with those things. We have to make sure that they're in places where people don't have access to them. We're keeping them safe. That if they were to be stolen, that they're password protected. So that's like a big thing, that our laptops have passwords on them. So if someone was to steal them, that's something that we put on them so that they can't access that information. So, flash drives, jump drives are kind of a different thing. Try not to put confidential information on them and take them away from the ECH network. We want to make sure that we're not taking information that way, because it can be lost or stolen, or someone else can pick it up and access it. Should also say that you want to make sure that your computer is locked when you walk away from your desk. So it could be that you're doing something on your computer, putting in progress notes, something happens, a crisis that you need to go respond to, you leave everything up, and a kid walks into your office and can access a lot of that. So most of our computers, I think, will lock after a certain amount of time, but you want to make sure that it's doing that if you're going to be leaving your office for an extended amount of time, and make sure that someone can't get on and access that. So that's important. try to save everything that you can, internally on ECH computers, ECH drives, so that you're not needing to access that information outside of ECH, because that's when it, gets kind of dangerous, is when you do put it on something like a jump drive or a flash drive and someone can access it. Social media, we've talked about a little bit, but just keeping in mind that social media is something that we should use as little as possible. We talked about not being friends with clients ever on social media. Also, not posting pictures of kids on social media. And also, just in general, being careful about what you post about your job on social media, not to disclose confidential information about a kid or something that happened. When I was a therapist, my rule of thumb was I was never going to post anything on social media that I didn't want a kid to see. So I know we all have hard jobs. I know we have stories that happen at work that we really want to share that, are pretty outrageous, and people may not believe that this is what our job is. But it's important to remember that those are confidential situations. And even if you take the name out, or even if you don't put identifying information in it, some people can still figure it out. So if you do post about your job, just be thoughtful, be careful, think about it before you post it. I have friends that are therapists and counselors that post things that happen in the therapy and the counseling room, without clients' names. But sometimes that still makes me nervous because that is confidential information. And so, like I said, my rule of thumb was always I never wanted to post anything that I wouldn't be okay with a kid seeing. And so, if you do post about your rough day at work, there's a possibility that a kid could see that and they could think that maybe you don't like your job, or that you don't like working with them. And so just be careful about what you post on social media. And like I said, of course, no confidential information, pictures, identifying information about the kids or the situations that we work with on a daily basis. Probably just best to avoid that at all if you can. So cell calls and text messages, we've talked about this too. I think this is a really important one for when you're on call. So if you are ever on call, if that was required in your job, thinking about where you may take that call. So where you may answer that phone. Whenever I was on call, I always had a plan. If I was out to dinner or at a baseball game or with family, I always kind of thought going into that situation, okay, if this phone rings and I have to deal with a potential situation, where am I going to do that so that it's confidential for me and for the client? And so you want to make sure that you are taking those phone calls in a confidential place. If you are in a place where you're in public, you may have to go out to your car or drive home or whatever it is to make sure that you're in a confidential place when you're having that call. Text messages are dangerous too because our text messages pop up across the screen of our phone, and we want to make sure they're password protected. That's really important. But even if they are password protected, sometimes that little blurb that shows up on the phone, someone else can see and could have clients' information in it. So I would say, if you need to text about a situation, try to use the client's initials and be brief. If at all possible, avoid using text messages. Maybe you can just text like, there's a situation, can you please call me? Use it a little bit more in that way so that you don't have confidential information, stored in a text that someone could potentially see or could potentially be accessed if your phone was stolen or lost or anything like that. So it's just important to think about this, how that's used. There are things that you can do in your job to make sure that you promote confidentiality here at ECH. And we've already talked about some of these, but I just want to go over them and make sure that you're aware of the ways that you can contribute to keeping clients' information safe. So one is to maintain hard copy records under lock conditions when not in use. We've talked about this. They've got to be locked behind 2 locks. When you're done using them, return them. Don't take them off campus. those are some things that are helpful around hard copy records. So the other thing is that you can place hard copy documents to be trashed in shredding containers. So if you have information that is sensitive and you don't need it anymore, make sure you're putting that in a shredding container. So there are containers around the office that you put information into, and then they're shredded so that client information is not shared. So don't be putting those documents in the regular trash. You want to make sure they're being shredded. Also, use strong passwords on your computer, on your electronic devices, and making sure you're not sharing those passwords with people. If you do, write them down to remember. Make sure you're keeping that in a secure location so it's not accessed. It's not just sitting out on your desk or taped to your laptop or anything like that. We talked about this, but making sure you're not using external email to communicate confidential information. That external email kind of means two things to me. One is that, if you're using Wi-Fi at home or out in the community, making sure you're careful about what you're sharing. I know that can be a little bit challenging, but good to think about as much as possible. And then the other one is when you're sharing information with outside providers, that you're careful about what you're sharing with them, even if you have the release to talk to them. We talked about that situation with the therapists in our FSK program, so it's a good example of that. Also, store confidential information on secured network drives. We talked about this too, but just a reminder that when you have confidential information, it's best to save it on the ECH network drives instead of storing it off the network drive or on a flash drive or a jump drive or something that can be taken away from the office. The most confidential place is to make sure you're saving it on the network drive here at ECH. Also, again, something else we've talked about, but making sure not to leave computer screens open in the presence of clients. If you're working on a progress note and a client comes into your office, minimize that. Tell them, that I need you to knock before you come in, even if the door is open, or have your computer situated in such a way that when someone walks in the door, they can't automatically see what you're typing or what you're doing, so you have some time to change the screen or save a draft before you complete that note or whatever it is that you're writing. You just want to make sure that screens are not left open so that they can't see confidential information about other clients. And then scan your work environment for potential confidentiality breaches and work to close them. If you see something, say something. If you notice that files are being left out, or you're going to leave for the day and you kind of look around your own office to make sure that your computer is locked, or you make sure that you haven't left files out. A really good example is our computers here in my office, they lock on their own after so many minutes of not being active. And so usually when I leave for the day, we don't usually have clients in our office and our door is locked, so I just leave my computer up. I usually close everything out, like my email and everything, but my computer is just still on. And when I come in the morning, it's locked because it locks after so many minutes. And I came in the other day and it was still on, so it hadn't locked overnight. So I don't have a lot of client information on my computer necessarily because I don't work directly with clients, but there are ways that someone could get on my computer, and if they did know my FamCare password, or they could see my email if I was logged into my computer, that they may be able to get to something confidential. So that was something that I wanted to check on and make sure that my computer was logging me out when I left the office. Also, when I use other computers on campus, so if I go down to our training room, or if I log into a computer while I'm there in Kansas City and I use my login, after I'm done using it, I'm going to hit log out or switch user or Control-Alt-Delete, whatever that is, so that the next person that comes and finds that computer cannot log in as me, and they can't access anything that I can access. So those are some ways that you can make sure that you're keeping your computer safe and keeping that information confidential. And just ways that you scan your environment to kind of say, Is there something here before I leave for the day or when I come back in that may show me that I didn't keep things as confidential as I needed to? And like I said, if you see something with another employee or someone that you work with, just mention something to them. Maybe you shouldn't be leaving those files out, or I noticed you had your notes up while you were talking to this kid in your office. So those are all things that you can say and help to make sure that our client's information is kept confidential at ECH. So we're going to do a little quiz together. I'm going to go ahead and I'll just pop up the questions, and then I'll give you a second to think about what the answer might be, and then I'll give you the correct answer. So all ECH clients are afforded identical rights. This is a tricky one. It is false because we have certain program rights that we talked about. So while they all get some of the same rights, there are those universal rights we talked about, there are additional rights that are afforded to each individual program. A client may file a grievance about a rights violation to an internal or external source. That's true. So we talked about the fact that when clients are or family members of clients or guardians of clients are unhappy about their treatment here at ECH, whether that's about their rights or confidentiality or discrimination, they can grieve to someone within the agency, which it goes up that level of appeals if it needs to, all the way up to the chief operating officer. Or if it's, they can do it to someone outside, like Children's Division or DMH. Staff should refer all grievances immediately to the Chief Executive Officer. That one, of course, is false. We talked about that there are different levels and things that, we want to handle things at that first level with the primary staff. And then there are reasons that it can go up to that person's supervisor or even all the way up to the Chief Executive Officer. Actually, it goes up to the Chief Operating Officer, so that's a double false. But we don't immediately ever want things to go there. We want to try and handle them at the lower levels if we can. Confidentiality only applies to current clients. This one is also false. So we talked about how we want to make sure we're protecting the confidential information and the rights of clients who are past clients and current clients. So once a client, always a client is a good rule of thumb. There are exceptions to a client's right to confidentiality. This one is true. So remember that there are certain times when we have to break that confidentiality, whether it's abuse or neglect allegation or a court subpoena or a court subpoena, or if there's a written authorization or a duty to warn. So there are times when we do have to share confidential information. Clients have a right to expect and copy their record. True. So clients do have the right to do that. We talked about that. There's a process for that. So you would want to let your supervisor know if a client is interested in that. So multiple choice questions. Which federal law governs confidentiality? OSHA, FMLA, HIPAA, or FTCR? Hopefully you guessed HIPAA. That's a big law we talked about. That's a federal level that governs all the confidentiality. There, like we talked about, there are additional state laws, additional regulations through our regulatory bodies, but that's the big one that everyone knows and applies to all health information. Which of the following are the basic tenets to client confidentiality? Need to know, deniability, minimum necessary, or both A and C? And hopefully you answered need to know and minimum necessary. Remember, those are direct from that HIPAA law, and so we always make sure that only the people that need to know, and even with the people that need to know, we're giving them the minimum necessary that they need. Confidentiality standards apply to which type of communication? Verbal, written, electronic, or all of the above? Hopefully you answered all of the above. So verbal, written, and electronic. Remember, it applies to things that we say, whether that's on campus or out in public, and also things that we write, like progress notes, and then electronic information like email and text messaging. Which document is provided to each client at admission outlining confidentiality rights? Progress note, disclosure sheet, privacy notice, or insurance waiver? Hopefully you answered privacy notice. That's right. The privacy notice is what we hand out at admission, and then we post so that clients and families and guardians are aware of their rights. So an essay question. What safeguards can ECH staff use to protect confidentiality? I'll give you a few minutes to think about this. So these are the few things that we talked about to make sure. Be judicious about taking client records away from offices. Place hard copy documents to be traced in the shredder. Use strong passwords. Don't use external email to communicate confidential information. Be candid with clients about confidentiality limits in electronic communication. Store confidential information on secured network drives. Don't leave computer screens open in the presence of clients, and scan your work environment for potential confidentiality breaches and work to close them. We've talked about all of those. So this is the end of our training. Normally, of course, when we do this training in person, we would have some time for questions. So if you have questions specifically about things that we talked about today, you can talk to your supervisor, and if they don't have the answer, then I'm sure they can find someone that does. Also, remember that policies are in Inspire, so you can look at some of those things if you want to know more about confidentiality and how those policies work. Remember that each of the policies that pertains to certain information is listed on PowerPoint slides. You can look up those specific ones. So thank you for attending the training. You completed training on client rights and confidentiality, so make sure to let someone know that you've completed that so that you can get your hours.